Hey everyone, my name is Ted Kim, and this is my 5-year-old daughter Eliana, my 3-year-old son Nathaniel, and my 1-year-old Annalise, and my wife Brittany.
We met in the Seattle area where Ted had his first job as a pastor at the church I grew up at. Yes, I was raised in the vineyard, was there from a young age, and that was my home.
I grew up actually in the Midwest, so my parents are immigrants from Korea, and they moved over here to the States to do some higher education. My dad ended up being an engineer at General Motors for many years, so we grew up in Michigan. But I came to Chicago to go to university. So I went to university on the south side at a place called the University of Chicago, and I came to the Evanston Vineyard after I graduated because I thought, man, this could be a great place to launch me maybe as a pastor. And I got probably more than I bargained for. My parents were immigrants. They're immigrants from Korea. They moved here to do higher education. So my dad worked for General Motors for a really long time. My mom came over to the States so that she could do actually like a seminary degree. They landed in all places in Lexington, Kentucky. They were 10 minutes from each other. They met each other. They fell in love because they were the only people who could speak Korean probably. And so I grew up as a Korean American child in the state of Michigan. And basically for the first 17 years of my life, I wondered if I was Korean and wondered if I was American because my home, totally Korean. As soon as I walked out of my home, totally American. So when I went to college, I explored that, trying to explore like who actually am I? And so I went to college at the University of Chicago, and there were lots of Asians at the University of Chicago for whatever reason. And so I just spent time with a lot of Asians. And then I started to realize, wait a second, we have these incredible ethnic blind spots, that I don't think that I was fully aware of until all I did was spend time with people that were like me. And so I thought, I need to go to a church that's a little different. And so I ended up coming to Evanston Vineyard. So I came here. And part of the reason why I came here was because I was a worship leader, and I thought if anyone could get me a job as a worship leader, it would probably be a vineyard. And so I interned here. I was here for like, I don't know, 4 or 5 years. I went to seminary while I was here, and then I left seminary for a pastoral job in a vineyard in the Pacific Northwest where I met my wife. She grew up in the vineyard. I've been in church ministry for 20 years. So we had kids kind of late for us because my wife and I have been married 14 years. We had kids kind of late because my wife wanted to go back to school to do a graduate degree. So she has a doctorate in Old Testament from Wheaton. And so that I always like to joke that that's kind of like our first child, About 7 years ago, I went to Syracuse. I started working as a worship pastor at the Syracuse Vineyard, which is a large church in upstate New York. Started as a worship pastor. I've been leading worship like pretty much all my life. But that church, I think it's one of the finest churches I've ever been to, much less worked at. And so that church has been like instrumental in kind of helping me figure out what does church look like, as well as just kind of serving. It's a church about 1,500, 4 sites. And I'm an associate pastor there now. I sit on the senior leadership team. I still lead worship, but I oversee the weekend. What we call the weekend experience, which is basically just our services. We have lots of them because our building isn't very big. I love Syracuse. It's been a great place. Got me plugged back to the vineyard. I'd been away from the vineyard for almost a decade, got back into the vineyard, and it's just been an enormous place of growth and influence, and I've just gotten to do a lot of things since being there. Okay, he's texting me back. All right, so in addition to when I first got hired, I got hired on as a worship pastor, but that kind of changed because John, my lead pastor, started inviting me into these different kinds of conversations. He was just trying to start to build the senior leadership team. In fact, he didn't really have one until I got there. And so I was sort of like the first person on his team. And then, like a couple years ago, he finally made the thing official, and then we got a lot of other people, not a lot of other people, but a few other pastors involved. And so I just sort of have felt like it's been great being with John in that capacity, because we've talked through a lot of big picture things that I don't think I would have ever talked to about if I just kind of been doing the thing that I had been doing. So we have talked through hires, we have talked through finances, we have talked through buildings, through site expansion, talk through it all, because John's very collaborative when he's thinking about doing the next thing. Talked about discipleship, talked about preaching series, all of that, and all of that has been pretty collaborative, and so that's been sort of fun. A church should be led by a person who is led by Jesus, by people who are led by Jesus, and inevitably when that happens, Jesus or the Holy Spirit is going to tell the person or the people leading that church things they don't want to hear. And to me, what that means is there's no real choice. You do what Jesus wants you to do. And anytime and every time we don't do it, I feel like we ended up down a cliff. So I guess that's what I mean. I mean that I just mean that I think that the church's best course will always be with humble people who are like, what do you want? What do you want, Jesus? And led under the influence of the Holy Spirit and in constant relationship with Jesus. And that means that in dry times and in times when we're hearing things all the time, we're just constantly listening, I guess. That's how I see it. Yep. So one of the things that I believe about being a senior pastor is I believe that there's an incredible opportunity to create a place. So now this is not about church. Okay, this is about people who work at church. Okay, so for me, I believe that one of the biggest jobs that a senior pastor has is creating culture for people who work at a church. So I remember that before, when businesses would always talk about the customer comes first, well, that's changed now. Nobody talks like that anymore. Now they say the employee comes first, because they believe that when the employee comes first and when they take care of their employees, everything else takes care of itself. And so I think that one of the biggest challenges, or one of the things that I'm maybe most excited about, is thinking about what does that culture look like for real leaders. For people who have lots of passion and have lots of energy and lots of initiative, I guess my goal would be what would it look like for a senior pastor, or say that were me, to lead those people in a way that they'd just be like, man, Ted thinks that when it comes to church, I'm super important. And I feel cared for, but I also feel challenged, and I also feel like invested in, and all that. I think that's really, really important. And also the other thing that I think that a senior leader can do, in my opinion, is create or set culture for truth telling. Because man, I just think that the enemy of church and church staff culture is when people just can't be honest with each other. And so those are a couple things that I think about. But I'm also thinking, like, I also imagine that there will be some things from a vision standpoint that maybe God would speak to the senior leader or speak to me, and then those that would be something that I would think I have to be listening for, and that can happen communally, but at the same time I feel like I would feel the burden for that. The other thing that I think a senior leader has to do is sort of set the pace or the tone for the work of the Holy Spirit in a way, just to constantly be leaning into that. Well, I would approach leading a church that has that much rich diversity with that many different nations. I think that I would have to approach it with a posture of openness, listening, and humility, and also kind of an awareness of an acute awareness of my situatedness, my situation, kind of like the way that I think, the way that I am, the person that I am, the upbringing that I have. How do those things impinge upon my ability to have real community and to be in community as we are moving toward Christ and to Jesus with everyone? I mean, so on the one hand, it's about openness and about listening, but on the other hand, it's also about examination. So I guess those are the two ways that I would think about it personally. When it comes to a church, that's a big question. I don't know yet how to answer that question, except just to say that I think that my experience growing up as a third culture kid was that I was always uncomfortable. But like I used to think that being uncomfortable was kind of a bad thing. I think that acceptable discomfort for the sake of loving one another for Christ, I just think that could be like a great posture for all of us to have. Yeah, so I think that historically churches always try to answer 5 questions, right? So it's trying to answer the question, what are people for? It's trying to answer the question, so in other words, for what purpose were people created, and what are they on earth for? What are they supposed to do? What are they supposed to live for? How are they supposed to live? All those questions that are surrounded. What is the church, and what is its function? In the universe. How can I know God? Can I really truly know God? That's another question that churches try to answer. What is the Bible? Can I trust it? Is it authoritative? And then finally, what is the kingdom? But probably to a lesser degree, what is the kingdom? Those are the 5 questions that the church has historically tried to answer. And every generation, it kind of has to answer it a little bit differently, And so when it comes to what people are for, I think that one of the big issues or questions the church has to face is it has to face this question that we don't really have a good theology of the body. Like I'm talking our bodies, So how do we create a rich theology for our body, not just for what happens inside or what just happens for our souls or what happens up here, but the body and how it interacts with everything else, So that's one issue, I think. Another issue, I think, is that with the advent of all sorts of different kinds of things coming at people nowadays, how do we communicate to this generation and the next generation, the generations that follow? How do we actually cut through the noise? Okay, so before it used to be about information gathering. It's not about that anymore. It's all about curation. It's all about trying to figure out, what am I going to believe? What do I want? What do I want to take from and whatnot? What stories? I mean, my children have access to millions of stories, and all of those stories are compelling and beautiful, and interesting. They might not all be true, and they might not all be helpful. They might not all lead my children to a path of flourishing. And I think we got to figure out, how do we tell stories in a way that is sensible and attractive and compelling for people nowadays when they have access to everything? I think that's a really, really big question. Third question that I think is really, really important is the question of economics. The question of money. What do we do with money? How do we handle it? And I'm not even just talking about financial budgeting. But what kind of voice does the church have when it comes to the gross asymmetry of wealth globally? Can we do anything about it? Can we say anything about it? How can we talk about it? That's a big question to me. It's clear to me that we don't really know what to do with it. And money's talked about a lot in the Bible. So I think that those are a few issues related to those questions. So I think that one thing that's really clear in the Bible is that there will be life after death. And the shape of that life is probably going to, well, first of all, there's heaven, but then at the very, very end of time, there's this place, the place that we live in right now, that's going to be completely made new. And it's going to be joined with heaven. And God's going to be here, and he's going to dwell in this place. And the Bible tells us that his glory is going to light up the world, which I don't really know what that means, but I think that sounds pretty cool. And then I also, on top of that, I mean, like God is saying, "Behold, I'm making all things new. I made all things new. Behold, I'm making all things new." Well, I believe that that the initiation of the making of all things new starts now. And I think that that's part of the role of the church, to participate in the making of all things new, for a couple reasons. One, because I think that things that we do right now matter. Because if it is true that we will live on this earth, I mean, yes, it will be restored and made new, but it will be this earth. If it is true, then the stuff that we do today could matter, right? But then the other thing that I think about is that I think about like all the people that are watching, the church, and watching what the church does. I mean, it used to be that you start a church on the corner of in a town, everybody would think, oh, that's great, that's going to help a city. I don't think that's the case anymore. And so to demonstrate to a watching world that Jesus really cares about them, and that Jesus cares about us. And then I think even now, and in the climate that we live in, we don't think about our human predicament as just being on our own. We think about our human predicament being located in a larger sphere. Like we think about like the cosmic proportion of our problem, right? And so I'm getting in the weeds here a little bit, but all I want to say is that if it is true that at the very end of time, what we will actually walk upon is this same earth, yes, made new, and also new and heaven with it, everything that we do right now matters. And if it is true that everything that we do right now matters, the kind of activity that we find ourselves participating in is super, super important. And that's why I think that in terms of what the church is supposed to do right now, it needs to do justice, it needs to do beauty, and then when it does those two things, then we do evangelism. We talk about Jesus to people who don't know Jesus. I think that justice has always been a priority for this church. But the other thing that I'm really, really interested in is I'm interested in beauty. It's no secret that truth basically the truth is sort of under siege, but beauty isn't, and I think that we have the most beautiful story in the world. I think that the story of Jesus is the most compelling, the most beautiful story in the universe, and I think that to frame the story in with the word beauty, to frame that story with the word beauty, I think would be compelling to everybody. Moreover, I just think beauty is one of those things that we kind of have felt is optional, and I think we're sort of paying the price for that right now. Beauty, as I see beauty as harmony is one of those is one of the ways that I think about beauty. But I also think about beauty to me, what beauty is the reflection of in what we make or what we say or what we do of a God who is perfect in form and perfect in matter. So in other words, God is a beautiful God, and he's beautiful because everything he does is beautiful, and because everything that he is beautiful. And there's only one being in the universe that can claim that. God is beautiful in what he does and beautiful in who he is. And anytime anything reflects beauty, it points back to God. And that's why I'm so interested in beauty. And that's why I wonder, what would it be like if church could be preoccupied with beauty? What would it be like if church could champion beauty? Man, I think that would be really cool. And I think it would be really cool for everybody, especially people now who don't know Jesus and who don't think that there's any real truth. You could talk about a story that's beautiful. And here's the other thing that I think is really, really beautiful. The gospel, or the good news about who Jesus is and what Jesus has done for us and how Jesus has triumphed over sin and death, the gospel is the only story in the universe that makes death beautiful. It is the only story in the universe. It's the only narrative in the universe where death is part of the story of beauty. And I think that's really, really powerful. And when I think about beauty, I think about beautiful things. I think about making beautiful artifacts. I think of art, the free expression of art, but I also think of just doing things well, for the sake of doing things well, because we know that reflects our beautiful God.